And he really accuses levels of the charge that they were really meant.
In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the prominent figure in the Renaissance of the 16th century, a man named Baldassare Castiglione, whom you see pictured there, and one of the works that he wrote that became a European classic, a bestseller in its time, published in 1528, called The Courtier, in which he presented an ideal vision of the world. And I think if you remember back to some of the artwork that we've seen, Donatello's David, Michelangelo's David, we remember that the idealized figure of the human form began to appear in Renaissance art. And now Castiglione is going to go one step farther and actually give us a guidebook about how one ought to live his or her life in order to create or reach really that ideal place. And so I think that the question that we'll start with is, before we do that, is what does one do when things are falling apart? Does one give up hope? Does one simply throw in the towel? Does one resign himself to a gloom and doom? Or is there a way that we can find solace in the dream of an ideal world? And that's really kind of, I think, what Castiglione is trying to get at in this work called The Courtier. So let's take a look at where this all unfolds. This all unfolds at the court of the Montefeltro, at a tiny principality, again ruled by a prince. That is the Montefeltro family, in Urbino, which is in sort of central Italy. We've talked about that before in a previous lecture. And on the left-hand side, you see the Duke, Guidobaldo de Montefeltro, and his wife, Elisabetta Gonzaga. And if you remember, Guidobaldo was infirm and ill, sickly, so that his wife, in many ways, ran the court at Urbino and was in charge of court life. And again, we said that that was sort of an inversion that is turning upside down of the world. And Baldassare Castiglione was at Urbino for an extended period of time and became very good friends with Guidobaldo and in particular Elisabetta, because Baldassare Castiglione broke his foot when he was riding horses, and he had to convalesce someplace, and he was invited to the palace by Guidobaldo of Montefeltro, the Duke of Urbino. And during his stay, he, oddly enough, developed a very, very close relationship with the Duchess Elisabetta Gonzaga. However, the relationship was never a physical one, it was a platonic one. And again, that idea that we see in the Oration on the Dignity of Man by Pico della Mirandola, that idea, that platonic love. And this is true of Dante and Beatrice, Laura and Petrarch. So this is a fairly familiar trope in the Renaissance itself. So nonetheless, Castiglione is convalescing at this court, and he enjoys, let's say, the good life. Things are good, friendship is great, conversations and the chance to enjoy company are great, until it all came to an end. And that's where you see the figure on the right, seated. That's Pope Leo X, and he was of the Medici family, formerly Giulio de' Medici, who becomes Pope Leo X. And Pope Leo X changed everything in the Italian peninsula as he organized what came to be known as the Holy League to expel foreign invaders, the French, from the Italian peninsula. And remember that the French had come into the Italian peninsula trying to lay claim to their lands in the south in Naples, and also the legacy of Rome and the Italian peninsula was of great appeal to many rulers, the Spanish, the French, the Holy Roman Emperor. So Pope Leo is going to organize a Holy League in which he allies with the Spanish, who are then married to the Holy Roman Emperors, against the French. And at that point, the French lose their positions in several battles to the Holy League, and Pope Leo X is going to take over Urbino itself and install one of his nephews, which is called nepotism today, as the Duke, which meant that Castiglione had to flee. He was exiled, and we've seen that before with Petrarch. What does one do if one is a great and learned man humanist while in exile and moving around, they write. So that's what Castiglione does. He began his work in 1508, and he worked on it for the next 20 years, revising it, adding to it, and the book is not published until 1528. And when it was published, it really became quite a sensation and made Castiglione a well-known and celebrated man across Europe, again, because in many ways it's a guidebook of how to live the idealized life. So, that being said, and here is a picture of the book itself in Italian, Il Libro del Cortigiano, del Conte Baldassare Castiglione, and it came out again in the year 1528. So, the book is written in 4 parts, if you will, 4 chapters. And each part discusses the various elements that go into making the perfect courtier who would have lived at court in a principality, including the role of women in Book 3 of The Courtier. So women are going to get their due, but again, we're talking about women from families of great means, so we're not talking about the common, ordinary woman. And I want to say this, that courts, at least enlightened humanist courts, really existed for the courtiers, that is, the men at court, to polish their skills, their life skills, and to develop a courtly culture, that is, the language, the habits of mind, and the actual physical practices that go into making the life of a courtier. And again, this becomes very much sort of the Emily Post book of manners of its day, and it was printed widely in both the Italian peninsula, but then spread throughout Europe, translated into different languages. And the book is really a series of dialogues that allowed the young men and women at court in Urbino, it's set in Urbino, where he had been, that is Castiglione, to pass the time playing elaborate games. But these weren't games just simply to entertain and pass time. They were games with a didactic purpose that allowed the players to develop their skills and show their wit. Something we're going to see later on in the French courts of Louis the 14th, 15th, and 16th. So, that being said, it's game time, and the game was conducted by a woman. Again, not Elisabetta Gonzaga, the Duchess of Urbino, but her first lady who attended to her, Emilia Pia. She's going to run the game, and she focuses the game on trying to come up with the definition of the ideal courtier and the ideal courtly woman. Now, the characters in the book are actually real people who really existed and lived at the court of Urbino when Castiglione was there. And the characters, if one were to read the book, are realistically and carefully drawn. And the struggles that the characters undergo and the conflicts that they engage in lend the work an air of theater and drama. So don't consider this as simply a dry sort of guidebook of how-to, but a lively series of discussions and interactions in which characters deal with conflicts, show their wit, resolve those conflicts, all the while developing this definition of what it is to be a true courtier and to live up to that ideal. Now, that being said, the tone of the book itself, however, is one of melancholy and twilight. There's a sadness at what had been lost in Urbino. So the great height of the Principality of Urbino under the Montefeltro family had been lost when the Medici took control of Urbino and installed one of their own to rule the city. And so the whole work is sort of this tinged with this sadness at what had been lost. And that's an important point. And in fact, Guidobaldo himself is ill and sickly, and they're not able to produce an heir that's going to be able to carry on the family line and the dynasty, and so that's what makes it more possible for the Medici, in fact, to come in and install one of their own to rule. So, and the other thing, the background for this is also the barbarians who invade the peninsula. we had the French who invaded, and this is something that's interesting. The French are called barbarians because they're from Northern Europe, much like the barbaric Germanic tribes during the Roman Empire that came and conquered and destroyed the Roman Empire. And Machiavelli himself, in his work, The Prince, refers repeatedly to the French as barbarians. And the fact that they're invading the Italian peninsula is something that causes great distress, anxiety, and concern. Well, it wasn't the French that did in Urbino, it was actually the Spanish and the Holy Roman Emperor and his troops that did this in. So the Italians are really kind of under constant siege and threat of invasion from the barbarians from the north. And remember, barbarian, somebody with a barba or a beard, meaning that they're uncivilized. And that is, the Italian peninsula and the inhabitants of the Italian peninsula are highly civilized. Again, the humanists and the humanist culture and the legacy of Rome, whereas the people from the north are not. Now, we're going to see that that's not true when we learn about Erasmus and northern humanists, but at any rate, that's the sort of background and setting. And so what Castiglione is really trying to do here is say, look, the world might be in a state of flux, a state of constant warfare. It might be the twilight of the great happiness that the Italian city-states had enjoyed in the 1400s. However, not all is lost, and so what Castiglione is really writing about is, though the barbarians are real, and they're invading, and they're wreaking havoc on the Italian peninsula, what is actually going to happen? Well, you can think of it as the light of civilization and culture being snuffed out. However, Castiglione, in writing The Courtier, says there's hope. And that hope comes through the writing of this book, in which characters engage in these witty games and dialogues in terms of trying to define the ideal courtier. So the book is not about real life, because that's tinged with sadness and loss, but the book is really about the potential of human beings and the human spirit to improve and perfect themselves. Let me repeat that. So the book is really about the idea that human beings can, in fact, improve and perfect themselves through education and learning and, again, playing these elaborate games. So in that way, the courtier becomes a metaphor for life. And although the barbarians are at the gates, and yes, the barbarians can destroy buildings, they can burn works of art, they can loot, and they can pillage, and they can rape, yet they cannot destroy the civilized spirits of the Italian culture and the light of the humanistic learning that will always, in many ways, sort of prevail. So at the end of the day, I think this elaborate scene at a court, a ball, indicates what Castiglione was really trying to suggest in this work, and that is there is an ideal world, in which humans behave well, that they strive to achieve greater learning, and they try to recreate this paradise on earth. And remember, if we go back to the biblical story of the Garden of Eden, that paradise had been lost. So in many ways, I think the idea here is paradise can be regained or refound through the exertions to recreate this ideal life. And so what is it that a courtier has to do? Well, you have to be able to obviously read Latin. You have to be able to read vernacular poetry. You have to be able to sing beautiful songs. You have to be able to dance. You have to be able to ride a horse. You have to be able to entertain people with witty comments. And those are all things that make up this ideal portrait of a courtier at court life that is going to sustain the idea of civilization. And I think that's why the courtier itself had such wide distribution, wide acclaim, and remains one of the great works of the Italian Renaissance. And so I wanted to throw this in before we move to the Northern Renaissance and the Reformation, just to let you know that this is important, and we'll possibly read a small, brief excerpt of this in class to solidify this idea of what it is that a core year can do, and think about whether, in fact, the idea of the core year has influenced our own society. We expect students to take good courses. We expect students to be good athletes. We expect them to dance and to sing and perform on stage. And these are all things that, in some ways, people of means and good backgrounds are expected to achieve. So with that, we'll end here. Thank you very much.